challenge on days like today is to say something I haven't said many, many times. Something I don't think I have done, though, on a Palm Sunday is to give a lot of attention to the world into which Jesus enters Jerusalem as king. And that is to say that it was a world, a cultural, and a political situation that doesn't look anything like ours. But I thought it would be helpful to see the crosswinds of different cultural and political forces that are alive and well in Jerusalem at the time. And once we consider them and how effective and how effective they were and how much momentum they had in the first century, we'll, I hope, see that Jesus entering Jerusalem as king is just so much more than a nice story, good as that video was. It's actually something august and, in the right sense of the word, revolutionary, but just not in any of the ways we expect. I want to look at how, by doing this, the kind of king that Jesus comes as is not like any kings that anyone recognized at the time, and still not like a king or even a political leader that you and I would recognize today, because he comes to challenge the ideas of empire at the time. He comes to challenge the idea of national sovereignty and of Israel's, if you like, their chosenness. And he also comes to challenge any conception people had of God as king. So I'm going to look at, these are all kind of three separate ideas that are all converging in this little text of borrowing a donkey and riding into Jerusalem. So we're going to look at challenging empire, challenging being a chosen nation, and challenging the idea of what it was for God to be king. Challenging empire. You probably know that this is the heyday of the Roman Empire, the Pax Romana. And it had gone through an important transition at this time, and in many ways what Jesus does doesn't make sense unless we know this. Because the emperor at the time, Caesar Augustus, had inherited something that he capitalized on. Before him, you may remember from school history lessons, Rome had been a republic, and a pretty successful one, a pretty democratic one. The Senate ran a lot of the day-to-day life. There was a great amount of input and democracy from different people across the empire. But as it spread and grew, that became harder to maintain. And then, famously, Julius Caesar, before Augustus, had made his great power play, and he had decided to seize the republic and it was more like an autocracy, put it under his own control. Now, Caesar was assassinated, famously. His own turned on him. But the background to this is that in about 42 BC, the Roman Senate had actually declared Caesar to be divine. And there was an amazing temple monument erected to him. Now, here's why that's important. Because if he was, for the first time, ascribed divinity, then his heir and successor, who was his nephew, but he becomes known as his son because he's his heir and successor, Caesar Augustus, becomes what? The son of the divine, or the son of God. And it's Caesar Augustus, who is emperor at this time, who really runs with the idea of the imperial cult, and who very happily accepts this idea that he should be venerated and worshipped as some sort of god, or certainly at least chosen by the gods to be their ruler on earth. And so this is the situation that Jesus is alive, ministering in, and working in. There is the great heft of the Roman Empire. There are symbols of it everywhere. The soldiers walk the streets that people go about their business on. And not only that, but this is supposed to be the most successful era of that empire. You and I see this all the time. It is in any political leader's interest, if they lead a group of people, to try and make sure that the people get the message that Their leadership is the finest era that anyone is blessed enough to live in. Make the United Kingdom or Great Britain or the US great again. I am the leader who is able to provide the greatest prosperity, the greatest peace, the greatest security. And that's exactly what Caesar Augustus claimed. He had an amazing propaganda campaign called the Pax Romana, which reinforced the quote-unquote good news, which is what it was called, that Rome was at peace, that its borders were secure, that it was going through unprecedented economic growth. See, that hasn't changed very much. We still love to build empires and to then tell stories about our empires that they are the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that the people that are leading them, that we are, what do they say very often? We're getting on with delivering the people's priorities. We're moving towards economic growth and prosperity, even though we're quite often not. So this is the world that he's in. That's the politics. Now, if you were an outpost of that empire, as Judea at this time is, it's not at the center, it's not at the heart of it, it's one of the far-flung outposts. And what the Roman Emperor did was they put in sort of puppet governors to mostly keep the peace. Your job as a governor at that time was to keep making sure that people knew the good news, that the Roman Empire was the best thing since sliced bread, and also that they didn't get any alternative ideas about the fact that anyone else could be in charge or that anyone else would do a good job of being in charge. Now, there was a few ways that you could symbolize royalty, power, and being in charge in this world. And one of them was to cut down foliage and to use it to welcome and to greet royalty in a procession. You and I see whenever royalty comes to town, quite often if the royal family are making a kind of planned visit to any location in the United Kingdom, people will come out with bunting and their little flags and they'll wave them, and that's their way of showing a bit of patriotism and a bit of grandeur in terms of a welcome to royalty. So it was cutting down foliage, and foliage was associated with, we know this from certain coins and artifacts that we have from the Roman Empire. When Caesar would get his head on a coin of some kind, then there would be foliage around it to show this is royalty. This is what they're surrounded by. And so into this world and this situation comes Jesus with people cutting down foliage and palm branches as he walks through. He's not, in that sense, keeping the peace. He's challenging and threatening the fact that the Judean governor is letting this happen on his watch, and the crowds are going wild for him. And nobody is supposed to be focused on anything except the power and the sovereignty and the might of the Roman Empire. And here they are, basically anointing someone else as having royal authority. But then the Roman Empire isn't the only game in town. This outpost that Jesus is in has enormous national history and significance. This is Israel. This is the people of God. This is the people whose founding story we considered not that long ago through the stories in Exodus, where they believe that God rescued and delivered them from slavery as a people. He gave them a promised inheritance of a land. He gave them his law. He told them how to set themselves up as a people, and he promised that he would be with them in a covenant or a bond. This is a people who have the proud history of the Davidic king and his dynasty, and Solomon after him, and the building of the temple. This is the people that have understood their identity ever since to be those whom the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has revealed himself to and bound himself to and continued to be with, despite enormous black periods in their history where it seemed like the light had gone out altogether. And just as Rome thought that they had already arrived because they were the city founded on 7 hills, and they were always living out of that myth that they really were the kind of the superior kingdom on earth. So the Israelite people were always looking forward to when God would return and sort all this out. They were looking for a new Davidic figure, a son of David, somebody to come from his lineage in order to fulfill all the promises that God would be king and lead his people to victory, prosperity, and blessing. They were looking for someone to fulfill the scriptures that said that God was one day going to come and judge the heathen, the wicked, and the pagans for the way they had treated God's people. That he was going to make war against them, and that they were going to be the beneficiaries of that. That their nation would be made great by God himself once again. They looked forward to it. They eagerly anticipated it. So many people who were just normal, everyday folks in Judea at this time put up with the Roman Empire because they thought, well, we've had Babylon, who exiled us, and hardly any of us came back. Then Persia took them over, and then Greece took them over under Alexander the Great, and now we've got the Roman Empire. And so they could see the last time God was active in the land, and they think if we hang on just a bit longer, God will surely come and sort this out. That's what we're looking forward to and hoping in. And in rides Jesus on a donkey, which doesn't symbolize to anyone that swords are going to be picked up and that anyone's going to get sorted out. He comes on an animal which was universally the symbol of peacetime, of a lack of violence and war. It's not a war horse. And so not only is he challenging and pecking at the idea of human empire and empire building, but he also challenges this very precious national identity that with the right leader and the right military force and a bit of the wind of God's favor behind them, then all their enemies could be wiped out and this would get sorted once and for all. And he comes in on the donkey. And then we come to, so what was it actually looking like for God to be king? What do people think that would look like, and how does he challenge that? Interestingly, within Jesus' lifetime, there was people, you know how theologians sit around and come up with ideas and theories of what things mean in the Bible and in the holy books. There was a theology at this time that maybe what it would look like would be God would come and rule himself directly, that there would be no more middlemen, that there would be no Davidic sort of inheritor of these things, that it would just be Yahweh, their God, who revealed himself to Moses, and he would come and do it directly. And they were pontificating about what that would look like. Would it just be miracles? Would it be a bit like maybe a combination of the burning bush, or when he came down on Mount Carmel when Elijah was the prophet? There are there's such a scattering of pictures of what it looks like for God to show up in the Old Testament that they genuinely had no idea what it would look like. And into all of that, Jesus comes and does these very surprising things. Because it certainly doesn't look like military heft or might. It doesn't even look like some sort of phenomenon of creation, some flash going off and everybody wondering what's going on, that there's a new dynasty in town or there's a new ruler on the throne. It doesn't even look like the center of religious life, the temple being made this glorious center again, and the pagans driven out of it. It actually looks like God coming to Israel, to God's own people first, and saying, actually, you're supposed to be the guardians of God's truth and his love, and it being shown to the nations, as you will see throughout this week. That's one of the first fights Jesus picks, is driving out those in the temple who are misselling God and misrepresenting him to people. What it actually looks like is giving away and giving up power. What it actually looks like is a journey towards death and the complete emptying of self. And what it actually looks like is a completely undoing of religious power and prestige in any way, reducing it all to nothing, to rebuild what God's kingdom was actually supposed to be. And here's where I'll just hang all of this. And I know I haven't gone through the text as much, and I've focused on a couple of images, the palm branch and also the donkey. But when Angus read that passage, when he goes to get the donkey untied and he gives them instructions and they ask, why are you doing this? Say, the Lord needs it and will send it back here shortly. Because Palm Sunday is part of a journey as Jesus heads towards the holy city, towards the Holy Week, and ultimately towards where all these stories we've been thinking about converge at the cross. And so, even with that nod, he's intimating this donkey, even though it is an animal, and even though I am being given power and prestige on this day, that is not actually why I've come this week. I'm heading towards something much greater, but it's something that no one would have expected. There is nothing that we can find in the history of the Jewish people, and certainly not the Roman people, that they were expecting that for God to come and show us what he is like and to truly be enthroned as king would mean that he gives up all vestiges of power, that he says that the temple's probably going to get destroyed and not be rebuilt, that he is universally rejected, including by those who say that they are following God, and even by those who say they are following him, and then ultimately that he dies a shameful death of a criminal. And no one saw that coming. And so the way God comes as king, there were plenty of hints at it in the prophets, but the prophets and everything I've talked about were always a wild card. And people much rather going to read the texts about the triumph and the might of the temple and Israel as a victorious nation than they did going to the prophets who said, actually, God is going to come and sort you out first, rather than you looking all over the world. So how does that apply to us? These ways that God came and that Jesus came and challenged the ideas of empire, challenged the ideas of chosen nationhood, and challenged even the very concept of God as king. How does that apply to us today and this Holy Week? Well, firstly, I think there's a challenge to whatever it is we look to make the world better. Even in the church, we can often find ourselves with vestiges of hope in political power, might, and heft in order to deliver the land flowing with milk and honey. And this is a brilliant time and reminder to realize that we belong to another kingdom, that we're called by and into a different kingship. And as we pass through this world, as much as God has asked us to take our part and our place in it, that it's unwise to become too attached to any of the forms of the way it's structured, because God is always challenging the way things are structured, particularly in terms of power in our world. He always has another way that doesn't look anything like the way power is ordered in this world. Perhaps we think if we just had more power or agency in a certain area of life, that it would actually make everything better. And the radical call of the gospel, as radical then as it is now, was to a call to weakness, a call to actually give up power. There's a great phrase that they do in the training at Erskine Waterfront, where I'm chaplain, where you're in a conflict cycle with a young person, and they use the phrase, drop the rope. Because if you've got two people pulling on a rope in tension, it never leads to anything good. But if one person drops it, if they can have that maturity and that sense of letting go of any perceived power, you can actually start a dialogue towards something better because the conflict's broken. And so it does call into, the gospel always calls into question our relationship to and our view of power and what we think it is for, and our trust in systems of power and empire. And I think there's a great application in how Jesus comes and challenges this idea of Israel being chosen and simply awaiting God to come and sort everyone else out, and finally their dreams and aspirations as a nation would be complete. Because judgment begins in the house of God. And Holy Week's an excellent time for us to remember that we are founded as a people of the most humble man that ever walked the earth, God came and showed us that really the primal virtue is humility. And we've got an opportunity to rededicate ourselves to that, to start with ourselves and to see what it is that we can give over to God rather than aspire to hold on to. And perhaps for us, it's even about being surprised by the way God works, because many of us can know what it is to hold on and hope and wait and pray in a form of darkness, to have our hopes frustrated and disappointed, as Israel often found themselves, and not really sure if there's any end in sight, and not really sure if even God is out there still listening and still caring. And Palm Sunday happens, and Jesus comes and shows he absolutely does care about this nation and about them fulfilling the promises of the kingdom of God. It just doesn't look anything like what they had expected. And maybe God working in your life will not look anything like you had expected, but if you're open to it, you might catch a glimpse of Jesus doing something unexpected, but really blessed, and even something that looks quite ordinary in your life. I think it's important that we remember in this week, in our prayers, that there are still a lot of places in the world, the Holy Land being amongst them, where that sense of national pride and identity is causing so much struggle. And I think we need to remember that whatever theologizing that people do around that ultimately we worship a king who came on a donkey and allowed himself to be led to death as the ultimate expression of power and victory. And so we've always got to ask ourselves, whatever our view of the world is and various conflicts around the world, what does it look like in light of Jesus who came as king on his way and on a journey to the cross? And then finally, there should always be a sense of rejoicing at the start of this week, that God has become king and continues to be king. The Psalms that we read, that Angus read and that I read at the start of the service, are not just a vain hope or aspiration. It just doesn't look like what anyone thought it would for God to be king. For God to be king means that he continues to rule from his throne, that he continues to spread the good news about who he is, that he continues to welcome all kinds of and any people to come and experience that and to find themselves in the community of his people. And then he partners with those people to keep remaking this world into something that glorifies him and is the original and beautiful vision of what a creation can be when it is praising God. And you and I, however small a part we take in that, we do take a part in it because of what Jesus achieves at the cross. He takes all the sting and all the power out of the forces of chaos, darkness, and evil. And by cancelling out their power in all of our lives, they make us able to partner with him in looking to have him enthroned and made king over all our world. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.